This is the story of Bob. While sailing the seven seas, his boat smashed into some rocks and sank. Bob became stranded on a desert island in the middle of the South Pacific. With a limited supply of coconuts for food, his outlook was looking rather bleak to say the least. Fortunately, it was the middle of the monsoon season, so water was not in short supply. This short, cheeky introduction lays the foundation to this presentation. I will be focusing on the events that occur during different states of fasting and starvation and relating this to Bob. More specifically, I'll be focusing on the post-absorptive state, which occurs 12 to 18 hours after his last meal, the early fasting state, which occurs 18 hours to 2 days after his last meal, the starvation state, which occurs greater than 2 days to several weeks after his last meal, and finally, what happens during late starvation when his fat stores have become depleted. Okay, let's begin. Now, the brain plays a central role in how Bob's energy reserves are used and distributed throughout each of these different states. This organ, weighing 1.5 kilograms, is by no means the largest organ in his body. However, when it comes to fuel consumption, it tops the list, requiring over 2,000 kilojoules per day to meet its metabolic needs. The brain's preferred energy source is glucose, consuming on average 120 to 140 grams of glucose per day. Unlike other organs such as the liver, which has the ability to store glucose in the form of glycogen, the brain lacks the ability to store fuel and hence requires a continuous supply of glucose. In fact, during an overnight fast, Bob's liver glycogen is almost depleted, due mainly to his brain's ravenous appetite for glucose. This marks the beginning of the post-absorptive state. Under the influence of the hormone glucagon and in the absence of insulin, his liver breaks down glycogen through a process called glycogenolysis to provide glucose to organs such as his brain. If breakfast is not consumed, skeletal muscle protein is broken down under the influence of cortisol to release glucogenic amino acids. This marks the beginning of the early fasting state. These amino acids are converted by his liver into glucose through a metabolic process called gluconeogenesis, also under the influence of glucagon. A quick note before I move on. Skeletal muscle represents approximately 40% of body weight and is the preferred source of protein during the early fasting state. However, essential proteins from organs such as the heart may also be broken down to provide amino acids. This is dependent on how much skeletal muscle Bob has to begin with. If his muscle bulk is moderate to high, then the potential burden on cardiac tissue to provide amino acids for gluconeogenesis during the early fasting state will be low. This is generally the case with most individuals, unless they are, of course, extremely underweight. Okay, back to the presentation. Bob's adipose tissue, also known as fat tissue, is also broken down during the early fasting state through a process called lipolysis, stimulated by both glucagon and cortisol. This process releases glycerol, which can be converted by his liver into glucose via gluconeogenesis. While glycerol serves as an important substrate in the production of glucose, a second and more significant product of lipolysis are the fatty acids. These now become the dominant fuel for his skeletal muscle and a majority of his other organs, including his heart, sparing glucose for his brain. While Bob's brain has a limited ability to use fatty acids directly as an energy source, it can use ketones produced from the ketogenesis of fatty acids in his liver. It is during this state that fatty acids become the dominant energy source for his body, reducing the breakdown of skeletal muscle and cardiac tissue and increasing his potential survival rate. During the starvation state, ketones become the brain's main energy source, providing up to 60% of the brain's energy needs, with glucose providing the rest. Over prolonged and late starvation, protein catabolism begins to rise again, resulting in the degradation of cardiac tissue and other vital organs. Unless this is rectified through the administration of a medically supervised intervention, followed by the gradual reintroduction of food, this will inevitably lead to the premature death of Bob. In summary, each of the 4 states described are unique in terms of how the body uses its energy resources in the production of energy for the brain. During the post-absorptive state, glycogenolysis is the dominant pathway converting the liver's glycogen stores into glucose for the brain. During the early fasting state, glycogen stores are spent and gluconeogenesis takes over by converting amino acids from muscle protein and glycerol from adipose tissue into glucose within the liver. At this stage, the fatty acids produced from the lipolysis of fats in adipose tissue become the only fuel source for a majority of tissues and organs. This in turn frees up more glucose for the brain. During starvation, the brain switches away from glucose to ketones as its main energy source. This preserves essential organ protein from becoming further degraded, extending survival time. Lipolysis of fats provides the fatty acids, while ketogenesis converts these fatty acids into ketones. Finally, once fat stores have become depleted, we enter into late starvation. Here the body switches back to breaking down proteins to provide fuel for the brain through gluconeogenesis of amino acids. During late starvation, survival time is extremely limited, as essential organs are broken down in an effort to provide glucose to the brain.